Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot returned something buried under the old oak tree. Out in the frozen dusk, Elias Carter found a footprint too big for any man. That night on his cabin porch, an old wedding ring lay waiting, the very one he buried years ago. He followed the silence into the trees, where a towering figure stood in the fog. Rifle trembling, Elias whispered, "Easy. I ain't here to fight." From the mist, a massive hand set down a knife engraved with his family's name. Elias lowered his gun, breath unsteady. "You brought it back." He laid his rifle aside, pressing a hand to his chest. Not every shadow harms, and as Bigfoot slipped into the night, Elias watched the forest breathe again. Voiceover warm and reverent. "Some legends don't haunt us. They heal us." In the wild heart of the American West, where the wind never stops its mournful cry and snowdrifts cling to the black pines, there lived a man whose silence was heavier than the storms. His name was Elias Carter. By the time the century's end was drawing near, folks in the nearest town had all but forgotten he was still out there tending cattle and mending fences on land no one else wanted. They said he was a stubborn soul, clinging to a place too cold for life, too lonely for a man to bear. But Elias stayed, because leaving meant abandoning the last memory of the woman he once loved. The cabin he called home stood at the edge of the timberline, its roof battered by winters, its porch groaning beneath his boots. Beyond it stretched a valley of frozen silence, and further still, the shadow of the deep woods. Elias lived by the rhythm of his herd, the creak of saddle leather, and the whistle of the wind through the trees. Each evening when the work was done and the fire burned low, his thoughts wandered to the past memories of a softer voice, a gentle smile that had long since vanished from this earth. There was a great oak tree not far from the cabin, older than any man in those parts. Its roots clawed deep into the frozen ground, as if gripping secrets from a time before settlers came. Under that tree, years ago, Elias had buried a small object wrapped in cloth, a wedding ring. His wife's ring. The day she died, he could no longer bear to see it. Burying it beneath the oak was the only way he knew to quiet the ache. And so that tree became his confessional, a silent witness to a sorrow he never spoke aloud. Most mornings he would stop by the oak, resting a hand on its weathered bark. The touch brought him a strange comfort, as though the earth itself had taken his grief into its keeping. But it also reminded him of the truth: some things once buried never return. That was the way of the frontier. Death came swiftly, and memories lingered like ghosts. To Elias, life had settled into a rhythm of endurance. Survive the winter, feed the herd, fix the fences, repeat. He told himself nothing could change that. No man, no storm, no trick of fate could stir what was lost beneath the roots of that oak. Yet the West has always had a way of testing such certainties. Out in those woods, legends breathed with the fog, and shadows carried weight beyond their size. Some men told stories of a creature too large to be real, too ancient to be forgotten, a giant striding through the forests, leaving prints deeper than any hunter's boot. Elias had never given such tales more than a nod, until the night something stirred the silence, and the past he thought buried forever came walking back to his door. Part 1. Tracks in the snow. The winter sun was sinking, dragging the light across the valley in long blue shadows. Elias Carter pulled his coat tighter, the leather cracked and stiff from years of hard use. He sat astride his bay mare, her breath fogging the air in steady plumes. They were making their way back to the cabin after checking the herd, when something unusual caught his eye along the frozen ground. At first he thought it was nothing more than the shadow of a drift, a trick of the fading light. But as his horse shifted beneath him, Elias leaned closer. There, pressed deep into the snow, was a track unlike any he had ever seen. It was huge, wider than his palm, longer than his boot. 5 distinct impressions spread out like the hand of some giant. And the depth, Lord, the depth of it meant whatever made it was heavy, heavier than a man, heavier than an elk. The snow was compacted to ice at the bottom, crushed by weight no ordinary creature carried. Elias dismounted slowly, his boots crunching on the frozen crust. The mare snorted, uneasy ears flicking back toward the trees. Kneeling, Elias laid his hand against the track. His fingers trembled as he whispered under his breath, "Too big for any man." The wind whistled through the pines, carrying with it a sound that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Not the call of a coyote, not the distant cry of a wolf. It was lower, deeper, like the groan of the earth itself. He straightened quickly, his eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing moved, only the long, dark shapes of the trees standing like sentinels in the snow. He thought of the stories he'd heard back in town, told by men who drank too much whiskey by lamplight. Stories of a creature, Bigfoot they called it, the wild man of the woods, hairy as a bear, tall as a house, a beast that walked on two legs, leaving behind tracks that made men shiver. Elias had always dismissed those tales. He'd lived long enough to know whiskey often carved monsters out of shadows. But staring down at that print, he felt something stir inside him he hadn't known in years. Fear. His first instinct was to leave, to mount the mare and ride hard for the cabin. But Elias was not a man who turned from the unknown. Life on the frontier had taught him that mysteries often had teeth, and if danger was near, better to face it now than let it creep closer to his herd, his land, or his memories. So he followed the tracks. Each step took him closer to the tree line. The prints led straight into the dark of the forest, their stride long, unhurried, almost deliberate. Elias felt as though he were being led, pulled along by an invisible tether. The deeper he went, the quieter the world became. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath his boots and the restless snort of his horse trailing behind. At the forest's edge, he stopped. The mare refused to go further, planting her hooves and tossing her head. Elias patted her neck, tying the reins to a low branch. Alone now, he stepped beneath the canopy. The air grew colder. The snow lay heavier, muffling sound until even his own breathing seemed loud. The tracks wound between the pines, disappearing deeper into the shadows. Elias's pulse quickened. His hand hovered near the rifle slung across his back. And then he saw it. Not the creature. Not yet. But a sign. A branch snapped clean at a height no man could reach. Sap oozed fresh and white against the bark. Something massive had passed through here, recent enough that the wound on the tree was still bleeding. Elias swallowed hard, feeling the old ache in his chest, the one that came when grief and fear tangled together. He thought of Mary, his wife, and the ring he had buried beneath the oak. She had always told him not to chase shadows. "Let the dark be," she would whisper. "It can't hurt you if you don't give it a face." But Elias had never been good at letting things be. He pressed on deeper into the woods. Each step felt heavier, as though the snow itself were trying to hold him back. The tracks grew clearer, fresher, and then, just as the last light of day gave way to night, he came upon a clearing. The prints circled there, pacing in a wide arc. At the center of the clearing, something glimmered beneath the moonlight. Elias crouched, brushing away the snow. His heart stuttered. It was a scrap of cloth, torn and weathered, but unmistakable. The fabric was the same pattern Mary had once sewn into a scarf years ago. He remembered it clearly, red and black, stitched by her hand. But that scarf had been buried with her belongings. He froze the scrap of cloth, trembling in his hand. How could it be here in the middle of the woods? Who or what had carried it? The sound came again, low, deep, a breath heavy as the mountains themselves. Elias lifted his head slowly, every instinct screaming at him to run. But he did not. His eyes swept the tree line, the fog between the trees. And there, just for an instant, he saw movement. A shape too tall, too broad. Shoulders that blotted out the moonlight. A silhouette that should not exist. Elias's hand tightened around his rifle. His breath caught in his throat. The shape did not move closer. It only stood watching, silent as the snow. When Elias finally blinked, the figure was gone. Only the trees remained, and the sound of the wind rising through their branches. He turned, clutching the scrap of cloth. His heart hammered as he stumbled back toward the cabin. The prints behind him stretched on endless in the snow, and though he could not see it, he felt it. Something followed him home that night. Part 2. The door to memory opens. The storm rolled in before dawn, a wall of wind and snow that pressed against the cabin like some living thing. Elias Carter woke to the groan of timbers straining under its weight, the whistle of air forcing itself through every crack. He stirred the coals in the hearth until they flared to life, orange light spilling across the room. The warmth did little to ease the chill that had lodged itself inside his chest the night before. He had dreamed of Mary. Dreams that were not dreams at all, but memories dredged from the deep. Her laughter carried on summer air, her hands brushing flour from her apron the way she once pressed that scarf into his palm before he rode out on a long drive. He woke with the scrap of cloth still clutched in his fist, proof that what he had seen in the clearing had not been some phantom vision. Elias moved through the morning like a man half-ghost himself. He fed the cattle, checked the fences, carried water from the creek now frozen at its edges. But his eyes kept drifting to the tree line. Somewhere out there, a thing larger than any man had walked. Somewhere out there, the past had clawed its way back into his life. By nightfall, the wind had died, leaving the world eerily still. Elias lit the lantern on the porch, its glow spilling out over the snow like a fragile beacon. He was reaching for the latch when his boot struck something. He looked down. Resting on the wooden step was an object he knew too well, a ring dulled with dirt, crusted with ice. For a long time he could not breathe. His chest felt hollowed out, carved by an ache too sharp to name. Slowly he bent, picking it up. The metal was cold, biting against his fingers. He brushed away the grime, and the firelight caught the delicate engraving inside the band. Mary's name. Elias staggered back, clutching the ring. His mind reeled. He had buried it, he knew he had, beneath the roots of the old oak, wrapped in cloth, hidden from sight. He had laid it down as a man lays down a coffin never to be disturbed. And yet here it was, placed carefully upon his doorstep. "Where'd you find this?" he whispered, voice breaking in the empty night. The only answer was silence. Silence so deep it pressed against his skull, heavier than the storm. The trees beyond the clearing stood black and still, their branches clawing at the moon. Elias turned the ring over in his palm as if it might speak, as if it might tell him who had unearthed it. His throat tightened until he could barely swallow. The ache of loss roared back through him, fresh and raw, as though Mary had died only yesterday. He stumbled inside, bolting the door. But the cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt watched, as though unseen eyes lingered just beyond the glow of the fire. He set the ring on the table and sat staring at it, unable to look away. The hours stretched. The wind rose and fell. At some point he must have dozed, because the next he knew the fire was low, the room dim. A sound pulled him awake. Not the wind. A creak. The unmistakable groan of a board on the porch. Elias snatched up his rifle, moving to the window. His breath clouded the glass as he peered out. The lantern still burned its flames, small and wavering. For a moment he saw nothing but snow. Then movement. A shadow passing tall and slow beyond the reach of the light. The boards creaked again. Elias's heart hammered. He raised the rifle, though his hands shook so badly the barrel wavered. His finger hovered on the trigger, but nothing came. Only silence. After a long time, he lowered the gun. He pressed his forehead to the cold window pane, his chest heaving. Somewhere out there, something had carried his wife's ring from beneath the oak to his doorstep. Something had circled his cabin in the snow. He thought of the tracks he had followed, of the shape he had glimpsed in the clearing. A shape too broad, too tall. The townsfolk had called it a monster. Bigfoot. The wild man. Elias felt no certainty. What he felt was something stranger, that whatever walked out there in the woods knew him, knew his pain. He sat back down, staring at the ring glinting in the lantern light. His calloused hands closed around it. He whispered to the empty room, "If you mean me harm, why bring this back?" No answer came, only the pop of the fire. But in that silence, Elias felt a shift. The world outside had not grown less dangerous, but perhaps not every shadow in the woods carried malice. Still, as the night wore on and the wind began to rise again, he could not shake the sense that he was no longer alone, and he wondered with a weight that kept him from sleep if something could dig up what he had buried. What else might it return? Part 3. Confrontation in the fog. The snow had stopped, but the silence it left behind was heavier than any storm. Elias Carter stepped out onto the porch lantern in one hand, rifle in the other. The world beyond the cabin glowed faintly under the moon, every drift of snow gleaming silver. The ring sat in his pocket cold against his thigh, a weight that felt both impossible and undeniable. His horse shifted restlessly in the corral, ears-pinned eyes rolling white. The cattle, usually quiet at night, lowed in nervous bursts. The air itself seemed to tremble with unease. That was when he heard it, a sound that did not belong. It wasn't the creak of ice or the groan of trees. It was a breath long-labored, heavy as a furnace. Elias froze the lantern, flickering in his grip. The sound came again, closer this time, drifting from the stand of pines beyond the fence. He set the lantern on the porch rail, shouldered the rifle, and moved toward the trees. Each step crunched in the snow, loud in the stillness. His chest ached with every heartbeat, his throat dry as dust. The fog had settled low, curling between the trunks, glowing faintly in the moonlight. It swallowed the world a few feet at a time, so that every shadow seemed to swell to breathe. Elias followed the sound of that monstrous breath deeper, his finger brushing the trigger guard. And then movement. A figure emerged, half shrouded in mist, broad shoulders, a towering frame. Fur dark as midnight, silvered at the edges by moonlight, two eyes faintly glinting fixed on him. Elias stopped dead. His rifle rose on instinct, but his hands shook so violently he could barely keep the sight steady. The creature did not charge. It did not roar. It simply stood watching. Its breath clouded in the air, each exhale rumbling low in its chest. "Easy," Elias whispered, his voice breaking the silence like a prayer. "I ain't here to fight." The creature tilted its head as though studying him. For a long suspended moment, neither moved. The fog swirled between them, pale ribbons twisting in the moonlight. Then slowly, the figure lifted an arm. A hand massive, covered in coarse hair, extended forward. Something glinted in its palm. It crouched, lowering the object onto the snow between them. Elias's breath caught. His rifle sagged as his eyes locked on the object. A knife. Not just any knife. His knife. The one Mary had given him, with their initials carved into the handle. He had lost it years ago, searching the high ridges after her passing. He thought it gone forever. His throat closed around the words, but they slipped out anyway, raw and broken. "You brought it back." The creature let out a sound, not a growl, not a snarl, but something closer to a sigh. A release. Then it stepped back, bowing its head ever so slightly, as though offering him a choice. Elias lowered the rifle. His heart thundered in his ears, yet some part of him, buried for years, stirred with something other than fear. Grief, recognition, a strange, fragile kinship. The wind shifted. For an instant the fog cleared just enough for Elias to see the creature in full. Towering, muscled, hair matted with snow. But its eyes were not wild. They were old, knowing. He wanted to speak, but no words came. Instead, he stepped forward, bent down, and lifted the knife. The cold steel bit into his palm, and with it came a flood of memory. Mary's laughter, her hand guiding his as she carved the first letters into the handle, the way she pressed it into his belt before his last cattle drive. Tears blurred his vision. He swayed, overcome, then steadied himself. When he looked up, the creature had not moved. It stood with its head still bowed, chest rising and falling slowly. Elias realized something then. He had always thought of the wilderness as a thing indifferent to his suffering, merciless, silent. But here was proof something had watched him, had understood his grief enough to return what he thought lost. Not every shadow meant harm. His rifle slipped from his grasp, landing softly in the snow. He raised his empty hands, pressing one flat against his chest, a gesture of surrender, of trust. The creature's breath rumbled once more, and then it stepped back into the fog, slowly, deliberately, until its outline dissolved into mist and moonlight. Elias stood alone in the clearing, the knife in one hand, the ring in his pocket. His chest heaved, but not from fear, from something harder to name: relief, gratitude, a strange, aching peace. The night grew still again. The fog drifted away, leaving only the whisper of the trees and the glow of the moon. Elias turned back toward the cabin, the weight of the knife and ring grounding him with every step. For the first time in years, he felt the burden of grief ease just slightly, as though the wilderness itself had reached out not to haunt him, but to heal him. Behind him, unseen, the forest breathed. Part 4. The Choice. The fire in the cabin burned low, casting shadows that seemed to stretch longer than the room itself. Elias Carter sat hunched at the table, the knife and the ring lying before him. 2 pieces of a life he thought buried returned to him by hands not meant to belong in this world. His palms pressed flat against the wood, trembling. His breath came uneven, like a man trying to steady himself after running a long distance. He had lived most of his years with certainty. Cattle needed tending winters, needed braving, grief needed burying. But the night and the fog had shattered those rules. Nothing in his life, no cattle drive, no gunfight, no storm had prepared him for this. He rose slowly, the floorboards creaking under his boots. Moving to the window, he peered out into the silver stillness. The fog had thinned, but the forest stood quiet, watching. He felt its gaze as surely as he felt the weight of the knife on his belt. And then it came again, the sound, that breath deep and heavy drifting from the tree line. Elias's spine stiffened. His hand fell instinctively toward the rifle leaning by the door. His fingers brushed the stock, then hesitated. This time he did not take it. Instead, he unlatched the door and stepped onto the porch. The cold cut through him like a blade, but he did not flinch. His eyes swept the yard, the corral, the snow that stretched toward the woods. The breath rumbled again. From the darkness, a shadow emerged, the same towering silhouette. Bigfoot. Elias's heart pounded, but he stood his ground. The creature stopped just beyond the porch fog curling around its legs. It did not advance. It only breathed each exhale billowing in the cold. Slowly, Elias bent down. His hands closed around the rifle. He lifted it not to aim, but to set it across the porch rail. Then, with deliberate care, he stepped away from it. His chest rose and fell as he spread his arms slightly, palms open. "Not every shadow harms," he whispered, voice low but steady. The creature shifted, tilting its head. For a long moment, the two regarded one another, the man who had lost everything and the legend no man claimed to understand. The wind stilled. The cabin light glowed warm behind Elias, a soft halo against the night. In that quiet, he lifted his hand and pressed it flat against his chest. A pledge, a promise. He would not raise arms against what had shown him mercy. Bigfoot let out a sound, something between a sigh and a low hum. Then, astonishingly, it mimicked his motion. A massive hand wide as a spade pressed briefly against its chest, not long, not deep, but enough. A gesture, a reply. Elias's breath caught. For the first time, the fear drained from him. What replaced it was harder to name respect. The creature stepped back, the snow crunching under its weight. Slowly, carefully, it began to retreat toward the tree line. Fog swallowed its frame bit by bit until only the gleam of its eyes remained hovering like embers in the dark. Then even those faded. The rancher stood alone, his hand still pressed to his chest, the cold biting at his fingers. He turned, glancing back at the cabin. The glow spilling from its windows looked different now, less like a fortress, more like a beacon. Inside, he sat again at the table, staring at the ring and the knife. But they no longer felt like symbols of loss. They felt returned, redeemed, as if some boundary between grief and grace had been crossed. For the first time in years, Elias whispered aloud, voice cracking under the weight of it. "Thank you." He did not know if he spoke to Mary, to the creature, or to the wilderness itself. Perhaps all three. That night, Elias slept without dreams. The cabin creaked. The wind whispered, but the shadows did not press against the walls as they once had. For the first time in a long while, he felt watched over rather than haunted. At dawn, he stepped outside to find the snow unbroken, save for a single set of prints leading back into the forest. He followed them only far enough to see where they disappeared into mist, then stopped. Some distances were not meant to be crossed. As he turned back, the rising sun caught on the cabin windows, painting the wood in gold. The sight pulled something loose in his chest, a soft, quiet hope. Elias Carter had made his choice. He would not chase the shadow. He would not raise his gun. He would live with the mystery and let it be. And for the first time in years, he felt as though the land itself agreed. Part 5. Keeper of the Woods. Morning came quiet and clear, the kind of winter dawn that painted the horizon in pale fire. Elias Carter stood at the threshold of his cabin, the cold air biting his cheeks, his breath clouding into the blue. The storm had passed, leaving the valley hushed and glistening, every branch burdened with ice, every drift of snow sparkling like glass. For years, dawn had always come the same, another day of labor, another round of solitude. But that morning something felt altered, as though the very air carried a gentler weight. The ring and the knife lay in his pocket, their presence no longer heavy but steady like anchors holding him to the earth. He walked toward the oak tree. The ground crunched under his boots, the snow hard-packed from the night's cold. The oak rose tall before him, its branches clawing at the sky. This was the place where he had buried the ring, where he had hidden his pain. Now it stood as a witness to its return. Elias rested a hand on the trunk, rough bark against his palm. He closed his eyes, breathing deep. For so long this tree had symbolized finality, what was lost, what would never come again. But as he stood there, he realized it had become something else. A bridge, a marker that his grief had been seen, answered, even honored. Beneath the oak, half covered in snow, he found the faint impressions of enormous tracks. They circled the tree, once then vanished back into the forest. Elias crouched, pressing his palm into one of the prints. It dwarfed his hand completely. Keeper of the Woods. He murmured the words, leaving him unbidden. That's what you are. For the first time in years, he smiled, not wide, not bold, but small, fragile, real. He returned to the cabin where the cattle stirred and the horse shook frost from her mane. The ranch no longer seemed empty. It was still hard, still cold, still lonely in its way. But the silence had shifted. He no longer felt crushed beneath it. Instead, he felt accompanied. The days that followed carried on with the rhythm of survival. Chopping wood, mending fences, hauling feed through the snow. Yet each evening, when the fire glowed and the shadows stretched long, Elias found himself glancing toward the woods. He never saw the creature again, not fully. Sometimes he thought he glimpsed a shape in the fog or heard a breath heavier than the wind, but it never came closer. It didn't need to. The people in town still whispered about the wild man, the shadow in the trees. Elias said little. He listened, let them talk, let them spin their tales of fear. Deep down, he knew the truth wasn't theirs to carry. It belonged to him alone. And he guarded it the way the woods guarded its secrets. One night, as snow fell soft against the cabin windows, Elias sat at the table with the ring in his palm. He turned it slowly, the firelight catching on its surface. For years, it had been a token of loss. Now it was a gift returned, proof that even grief could change, could be carried not as a wound, but as a memory. He slipped the ring onto a leather cord and wore it around his neck, resting close to his heart. That night he slept without fear. And in the dream that came, if it was a dream at all, he saw Mary standing at the edge of the woods, smiling. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The look in her eyes was enough peace. When he woke, he rose with a steadiness he had not known in years. From that day on, Elias Carter was no longer merely a man surviving alone on the frontier. He was something more, a guardian of a story few would believe, a witness to a bond unspoken. The land was still harsh, the winters still cruel, but he faced them with a lighter heart. At times when dusk painted the sky, he would stand on his porch and speak softly to the forest. Words of thanks, words of remembrance. And somewhere in the distance, when the fog rolled low, he thought he heard it answer. A breath like a sigh, deep and steady, carrying across the snow. Some legends, he realized, do not haunt. Some legends heal. The valley lay quiet under the glow of sunset. The snow caught the last light, turning the world into a sea of molten gold, fading into deep blue. From the porch of his cabin, Elias Carter stood with his shoulders squared against the cold, his breath rolling soft into the evening air. The ring hung on a leather cord against his chest, warm from the nearness of his skin. The knife rested at his belt, its handle worn smooth with memory. Behind him, the cabin windows shone like lanterns against the dusk, steady and warm. Ahead, the forest stretched into shadows and mist, vast and unknowable. Once that sight had felt like a threat, a constant reminder of how small and solitary he was. Now it felt like something else. A companion. A keeper. He had not seen Bigfoot again, not truly. Only traces a broken branch at a height no man could reach, a distant sound that stirred his horse, the faintest outline dissolving into fog. Yet Elias did not need more. The return of the ring and the knife had been enough. Proof not of fear, but of something deeper: recognition, understanding. Life on the ranch continued as it always had. Cattle still needed tending fences, still needed mending winters, still needed braving. But Elias no longer carried his burden alone. In quiet moments, when the fire was low and the night pressed against the walls, he would feel the weight of the ring at his chest and remember grief can be softened even in the harshest land. Standing on the porch, he whispered into the wind, "Some legends don't haunt us. They heal us." The forest seemed to listen. The wind gentled, the snow settled, and for a breathless instant Elias thought he heard that low, steady exhale again, like a promise that he was not alone. He turned back toward the cabin, its glow steady as a beacon. For the first time in years, he stepped inside, not as a man burdened by loss, but as one carrying a story worth keeping, a story of a legend that did not come to harm him, but to return what was lost, and in doing so gave him back a piece of himself. And that story, like the light in the cabin, was meant to be shared. Out here in the wild, where shadows stretch long and legends breathe in the fog, we're reminded that not every unknown carries danger. Some come to teach us. Some come to heal. In Elias's story, Bigfoot wasn't a monster. He was a bridge, a reminder that even in solitude, even in grief, we are never as alone as we believe. Perhaps you've buried something beneath your own oak tree, a memory, a sorrow, a piece of yourself you thought lost forever. This story is here to tell you, sometimes what is buried finds its way back. And when it does, it may not come as a wound, but as a gift. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you believe about legends? Do they frighten us, or can they heal us? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next tale from the Wild West, where myth and man meet in the twilight. And if you carry a story of your own, something you've buried, something you've found, let it breathe here. This channel is for you, for all of us, searching for light in the wilderness. Until next time, remember, not every shadow means harm. Some legends heal.